Hey, it's Joshua Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And every photo and video that you're seeing in this camera versus shootout was taken on the cameras of the LG G4 and the Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge. Now we're going to start off this camera versus shootout with some self-portraits. Now in these selfies, it's obvious that the G4 does tend to overexpose some of the photos, some parts of the photos rather, and also its field of view is a little bit more narrow. The S6 has a somewhat wider angle, but also it benefits from the wide selfie mode, in which you can use a panoramic motion in order to get more people into your shot. The G4 does have those gestures in order to make taking pictures a little bit more fun, but the main useful one is bringing the phone down to a viewing angle in order to see the portrait you just took. But now we're in a casino, somewhat lower light situations in which the G4 is still overexposing a little too much. When there's a prominent light source on the subject in lower light shots, it will tend to be more blown out. And there's no better situation to test this out in than a concert. With all of the band members and everybody being on the stage, very, very lit up, especially with spot metering. Even with spot metering, if you're tapping on the subject, you're probably not going to get a shot that's really nice to look at. And that is when the Pro modes come in. Taking the Pro mode from the S6, there aren't really that many settings to manipulate, but you can bring the exposure compensation slider down to -2, for example, and you'll get a somewhat better shot. But the G4 was better at exposing properly, despite the fact that with the higher and faster shutter speed, ISO had to compensate for it, and thus there's a lot of grain all over the place here. And with that, you can really take your pick between these two. Either you want a photo that's a little bit overexposed in the S6, or you can get a somewhat better looking photo in color and exposure in the G4 that has a lot of grain. Now you probably noticed already in those last two videos that when you hit the record button on either of these phones, the video goes back to the auto exposure settings. It's kind of a bummer that the manual settings don't do anything to the video content. But now we're in the Anaheim packing district, where the well-lit photos will really show us the kinds of details we can get with these photos. Now both cameras do a really great job, but the Galaxy S6, as it should come as no surprise to everybody, really does oversaturate a little bit. And in some situations it means that there are deeper blacks, a little bit more contrast, but really that punch in the colors is a little bit much. But a lot of people do tend to like those, and in the case of the G4, it gets a more accurate photo because of the color spectrum sensor. But this photo was one of those rare occasions when the G4 actually saturated the photo a little bit more than the S6. Again, very rare instance, but it did happen here. But like I mentioned already, the color spectrum sensor does help the G4 provide a more accurate photo, a little bit more drawn back than the oversaturation of the S6. So you really just have to take your pick here. The G4 will allow you to manipulate the photo a little bit better using the manual mode, and then of course you can capture in RAW simultaneously, so you can use the RAW capture photo in a program like Lightroom in order to make it look the way you really want it to if the auto photos aren't really your style. But while you guys are enjoying a few more pictures here between the two and you're making your own comparisons, of course, I do have one remark to say about the picture taking experience itself. The S6 did introduce a new shortcut in double tapping the home button to quickly bring up the camera, and you can start shooting right away. But the G4 also has its own shortcut as well, double tapping the volume down button. Now the problem is when you do that, the camera comes up and tries to take a photo. Now if you haven't framed the scene in your viewfinder correctly, or if there's just nothing to take at the time, it will take a couple of seconds to focus on basically nothing, and then once it takes that photo, that extra time is wasted until you're actually able to manipulate the camera to get your shot. It just makes the G4 that little bit slower in going from the prone position to actually taking photos. Now here's a video of me walking around, and just a bit of a behind the scenes take on this. I put both phones on a rig, on a rail, so that they were the same equidistance away from any subject. And then I picked it up and started walking around with it. Now this is an OIS test, and the larger sensor with the much more enhanced OIS of the G4 really does a great job here. You can see on the left side with the S6 that it's still a little bit wobbly. Meanwhile, the G4 does a great job of minimizing that when in comparison. So that's a really big feather in the cap of the G4. While the S6 might somewhat oversaturate and the G4 might somewhat overexpose, when it comes to details, I do think that both of these cameras do a really great job. It's only when you really zoom into the photos that you might find some disparities, and really it's not even that big. In this particular photo, you can see that some post-processing is detracting from the overall sharpness of the G4 photo. And like I said, it really only happens when you really zoom in. If you take the photos the way that they are, both of them look really great. It's just a matter of which one looks better to you. And that's the reason why, despite these 100 crops, I wanted to show you some very concrete examples of a horizontal view rather than these close-up side-by-sides, in order for you to actually see, at a first glance, which one looks better to you. And honestly, I could take either one of these photos and either one of these cameras and probably still be happy with what comes out. Definitely good for social media no matter what. But we do have some very concrete examples of the color in these video shots. I went ahead and hit record on both of them and put them on the rig, and it's obvious that in these videos, the left side, the S6, definitely punches out its colors a lot. But the thing is, the G4 colors are far from bland and they still look really nice. It's just that the S6 kind of overachieves, and if it's a little bit too gross of a punch for you guys, then of course the S6 is probably not the one you want. Alright, so we covered a lot of ground in this video, a lot of photos and videos, but as I usually do for these camera shootouts, I want to end with some foodie pictures. So especially for you Instagram foodies out there, and I know there's a lot of you, you can see which of these phones will be best suited for your needs. I do think both cameras are really great, and I can't emphasize that enough. We've come to a point in Android where the cameras are really getting really good, and they are probably able to replace the typical small point-and-shoot cameras that people tend to have along with their phones. And that's a great notion, and hopefully it'll only get better for more phones in this upcoming year. But nonetheless, keep it tuned here to Android Authority, and thank you guys so much for watching this camera versus shootout. Make sure you drop us some likes on our videos and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And if you haven't noticed by now, I went ahead and put the annotations over both halves of this video so you can check out the full reviews for the Samsung Galaxy S6 and of course the S6 Edge by Lon. And then over on the right, you can see the full review of the LG G4. Make sure you guys do that so you can really find out which of these phones is better for you, as the G4 was just released to all the major carriers here in the States. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are really trying to scrutinize between these two phones, and I hope this one helped you guys out. Once you're done with all of that, you can listen to the FTP every single week, and then head on over to AndroidAuthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.